Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Toby. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Monash University after just having completed my PhD in rare earth mineralogy and low temperature rare earth deposits. This presentation is one of the publications that arose from that PhD, and it's basically looking at how we can use chemical analyses and multivariate statistical analysis to define really large or often quite large supergene regolith-hosted rare earth element deposits. You will be familiar with some of the co-authors in this study. There are co-authors in the group with us at the moment. So if you have any more questions, feel free to either reach out to me or reach out to them as well. So yeah, let's just get on with it, I guess. So for those, I know we're all regolith people here, but for those who may not be familiar with regolith-hosted rare earth element deposits specifically, just by way of introduction, just a very quick intro to those. So the general formation model, obviously there are nuances as there are with every type of deposit, but the general formation model is that you take a granite or a granitoid rock of some description, and you weather it under tropical or subtropical weathering conditions, so lots of rainfall typically. And when you do this, you leach the rare earth elements from the top of the saprolite and you transport them towards the bottom of the saprolite or lower stratigraphic positions. So you go from low pH down through the profile to high pH. When you reach that stage, you then deposit the rare earth elements. You either deposit them by precipitating secondary rare earth element minerals or through adsorption onto co-forming clay minerals like halloysite or kaolinite. And that is just all the general formation model. There are lots of nuances to it in terms of needing rare earth element rich granites, in terms of needing a topological regime where you're at topographic lows because you want little erosion because you want to be able to preserve your deposit. And you also want potentially groundwater flow moving from high to low areas of topology. The study that is in the top left corner is a wonderful synopsis for these deposits and their necessary formation conditions for those who are interested. But that is just sort of the general formation model. Obviously, it's not that you can go to any granite and find a rare earth element deposit or any weathered granite and find a deposit, but that is the sort of basics of it. The important features of these deposits, at least in terms of the discussion that we'll have today, are that they are high tonnage, low grade is the main thing. A lot of these deposits can dip below 0.1 weight% total rare earth oxide. So they're very, very, very low grade as far as many deposits go. Meaning that you have to mine large volumes of them. So you have to characterize large volumes of regolith material in order to find economic regolith-hosted rare earth element deposits. Another key feature, as I was saying before, is that you get a mix of immobilization and therefore accumulation mechanisms for the rare earths. They can either be sorbed onto clay minerals or they can precipitate as dedicated rare earth element, secondary rare earth element phases, with both obviously having their own implications for extraction and metallurgy and identification of the deposit. But the main thing, at least in terms of this discussion and in terms of an Australian perspective, is that these deposits, with them being saprolites, with them being in weathered regimes or a regolith regime, they can also be buried, right? And as I was saying, in an Australian perspective, we all know that we have issues with buried deposits. And one of those issues for the rare earth element deposits is kind of the focus of this talk and why we might want to use these analyses to define these deposits. So we are going to play a very, very quick game that I'm sure everyone's played before. And the game is called, is it rare earth element mineralized saprolite or is it rare earth element barren transported sediments? Has anyone played this game before? Okay, I assume not. That's fine. So it's really, really simple. So we go through the clues. I'll give a clue each time, and then we can sort of judge whether we'd be confident in determining whether this particular sample is a mineralized saprolite or whether it's a barren transported sediment. So the first clue is an image of the sample. This presentation is designed to be a call and response, which is a little bit difficult over Zoom. So I'm just going to sort of go through the typical responses I've had when I get through these presentations. So when you take a normal rock sample, a lot of the time you can look at it and you can look at the mineralogy. If you were to take an orogenic gold deposit, for example, you might be able to even see visible gold. You'd probably usually be able to see pyrite. You'd be looking at areas with high concentrations of quartz. You'd have key indicators that you are looking at mineralization in many, many types of deposits. In regolith-hosted rare earth deposits, you're looking a lot of the time at regolith. You're looking at unconsolidated material. A lot of the time it looks very, very inconspicuous. It's really, really hard to determine whether you have mineralization in your sample and whether it's part of transported sediments or whether it's part of a weathered in situ saprolite. So with these deposits, looking at the sample itself is not going to do much. It's also super fine grained, right? It's mostly clays and fine grained quartz, etc. So we can't look at the sample and determine it. The next thing we might go to is mineralogy, right? If we can't visibly see mineralization, okay, well, let's see what minerals we have. Do we have mineralization within it? The difficulty, again, is that when you analyze a lot of regolith material, as I'm sure many of us in here have, you see quartz, you see kaolinite, you might see some relict, granitic phases, feldspars, micas, etc. But because of the concentrations and the low concentrations, you're not going to see rare earth phases in the bulk mineralogy. And bear in mind, this is on a backdrop of us having to characterize thousands and thousands of samples in order to be able to properly define a regolith-hosted rare earth deposit to the degree where it becomes economic, right? So we can't look at the material and we can't look at the mineralogy as a way of determining whether we have enrichment. We can look at the enrichment, right? We can look at the total rare earth grade, and we can also look at recovery. So in this sample, the grade is just under 1,000 ppm total rare earth oxide with about a 62% recovery with pH1 hydrochloric acid. I did this presentation not 10 minutes ago, and I said how many people would now be confident looking at the grade of the sample, whether that was a mineralized sample, and nobody put their hands up. Because even in this situation, the boundary between cutoff grade and what is economic and what is not economic is really difficult to discern because you need the bulk enrichment, right? You need those bulk areas. And so it can be a very, very fine line in some cases, right? So when you think of deposits, mineral deposits at large, there are very, very few where you can have a look at the sample, you can have a look at the mineralogy. I do apologize for that sound if anyone can hear that. We're having construction works coming through at the moment in our building. I'm hoping we're not going to get too much of that. There are very, very few deposit types where I'm going to hold this microphone closer here in case that helps, where you can look at the sample, where you can look at the bulk mineralogy, where you can look at the grade and recovery and still not confidently determine whether you have mineralization. I can't, personally off the top of my head, I can't think of actually any deposit where you can have all that information and yet no information. For anyone who is interested, this particular sample is part of the saprolite. It's part of the rare earth rich saprolite from Splinter Rock, which is the case study that we'll be using today and the case study we looked at. I'm going to very, very briefly gloss over the geochemical analysis that we did in order to do this. I apologize if everyone's already familiar with these sorts of analyses, but it's quite integral to understand to work out what's happening. The two things that we did were K-means clustering. So basically we took 3,000 samples from the Splinter Rock deposit, which I'll go over in just a moment. And we put it through a K-means clustering algorithm. And the idea of that was to say, okay, 3,000 samples, how do we group them based on similarity? How many groups do we have? And instead of us going through and manually trying to work out based on 35 elemental variables within the whole rock analysis, which ones are similar and which ones are not, we let an algorithm do it for us. In the case of Splinter Rock, the optimal number of clusters was 5 across all 3,000 analyses, and you'll see those visually in just a moment. The other thing we then do is the principal component analysis, which for those who aren't familiar, is a way of reducing those 35 elements, those 35 variables, down into, a lot of the time it can be into 2 or 3. And these 2 or 3 variables, these principal components, are basically representative of the largest degree of variance within the data set. Okay. You'll see the plot on the right hand side. The way that these two work, a lot of the time they work in conjunction. So you'll conduct the PCA first, which will provide the principal components, upon which you then conduct the K-means clustering. Once the K-means clustering is done, you translate those clusters back onto the principal component, which is the 5 colors that you see here on the PCA graph. So that PCA graph, once you go into depth, you can start working out what the geochemical nuances and the characteristics of each of your clusters are. And from that, you can use that with other things to help determine what your clusters are in the context of real geology. Okay, so I hope that's relatively glossed over it quite quickly. I hope that at least makes some sense. I hope it will also make sense as we go through the case study. I'm going to really quickly gloss over the geology of the splinter rock area. Um, there's huge amounts of publications been written on this. A lot of you might already be familiar with it. Basically, splinter rock sits in the Albany-Fraser orogeny, which sits on the edge of the Yilgarn Craton. During the formation of the Albany-Fraser orogeny, or shortly thereafter, there were intrusive granites that came through, and those are the granites that we're looking at in this case study. So a lot of these are over 1 billion years old, so they're very, very old granites insofar as regolith-hosted rare earth deposits go. A lot of them, like I said before, tend to be quite young because you want to preserve them. You don't want much weathering. You don't want much erosion. You don't want them to be buried and destroyed. In Australia, we don't have that luxury, right? So that is one of the things from an Australian perspective that we need to really consider and work out how we're going to deal with that and what that means for potential deposits moving forward. So yeah, we have intrusive granites of the Bianya suite and the Truslow suite, just over 1 billion years old. Over those billion years, we've then had sedimentary deposition. We've had marine incursions during the mid to late Eocene, and we've had post-Eocene cluvial, alluvial, and aeolian sediments deposited on top of these saprolites, on top of these weathered granites, right? So we are having to now not only deal with the difficulties of low grade and high volume, but also we're doing it through transported cover. And we're having to separate the transported cover from the potentially mineralized material. That is where the sort of geochemical analysis comes in. And I hope we'll be able to demonstrate that over the next couple of slides. So when you run the k-means on these samples, it comes back with 5 clusters. That comes back as sort of the optimum number of clusters. And then when you map those clusters onto a cross section of the splinter rock deposit, that is the map that you see at the bottom right-hand corner, right? There are a couple of features of this map that are quite interesting. The first is that the k-means has managed to define horizons that are stratigraphically continuous, meaning that there's not a huge amount of samples that don't fit where they should based off unsupervised analysis. I've not had any say in this. I just let the clustering do itself, and it's managed to return to me a model that at least, from the first look makes geological sense because you have stratigraphically continuous horizons in red, orange, and yellow. The yellow one's a bit more interesting because it seems to be forming these lenses, right? And so when we think of that from a regolith perspective, we go, okay, are these erosional features? Are they paleo valleys? Are they all this sort of thing that then these sediments could be infilling? And then underneath that, in the green and the blue, you have what is likely the granitic saprolite and the saprock in the blue. So we've run these analyses and it's returning data that makes geological sense, at least from the initial perspective. The way you then validate that, and we did this with CSIRO, is that you use techniques that can analyze these logs really, really quickly and give you lots of mineralogical information, lots of geochemical information, even crystallinity information for kaolinite. And you can see if these match up with the clusters that the k-means cluster in the PCA gave back to you. In the case of splinter rock, they match up really quite nicely. So if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner at SRAC 0227, you can see that, I don't know if everyone can see my mouse, I'm hoping they can. In this green area here, the saprolite, we've obviously got a very distinct change in color from this red color down with depth into the gray. We've got a distinct change in kaolinite crystallinity, as you'd expect going from a saprolite to a saprock. You've got a distinct change in mineralogy, so you've got actually primary minerals still left in the saprock at the bottom here. That will be the plagioclase and the K feldspar. That's all altered to kaolinite when you come up to this saprolite portion, and that matches really, really nicely with our clusters. The same thing actually happens with transported sediments to a lesser degree. The transported sediments are more complex because they can't really be described with just 3 clusters. Those clusters are There are clusters within those clusters, basically. And if you were to add more, then you'd get more complexity, but you'd also increase the complexity of your interpretation. So there's sort of a balance to be found there with these sorts of analyses. But generally speaking, the transported sediments align really nicely with what the k-means clustering spit out. So that is a way of validating, okay, we've done this analysis, it's returned these results, and actually mineralogically it makes sense, geologically it makes sense. We can start to build some confidence in our interpretations that these clusters that came back represent real geological features. And actually, in this case, when you do the interpretation from the chemistry and from the mineralogy, as we do in the paper, the general sort of feeling is that you have a granitic saprock, you have a granitic saprolite in green. The yellow probably represents some portion of the Werelip formation, the orange, the Werelip and Pananut formations, and then some overlying alluvium, colluvium, and Aeolian sediments. That happens not just at center, but at prop as well. So there are two distinct cross sections that we looked at, at decent distances apart, but within the same weathering regime, within the same granitic regime, and they show the same features and the same dispersion, both in terms of the cross sections and in terms of the PCA results as well. So there's a lot of confidence that you can start to build by looking at things in different ways. Once you've then defined these 3,000 samples almost instantaneously using this geochemical analysis, you can then start to relate different parts of the geochemistry and different parts of the deposits, and you can really start to build a really good picture of the deposit that you have and its structure and where you can go in terms of exploration, mining, extraction, etc. So for instance, here we have the clusters, and underneath we have the grade of the samples. I didn't mention before, each of these boxes is a 3-meter interval. Okay, so they're averaged over 3 meters. That was the way the exploration company OD6 Metals did it. That was the data we were given. And actually, for the depth of the drill cores, it's a relatively reasonable sort of averaging. So in terms of grade, the one thing you'll notice straight away when you have low grade in darker colors and high grade in lighter colors is at that interpreted transported sediment saprolite boundary, where that dotted line is, you see a very distinct change, generally speaking, in grade. You see an increase in grade below that line, right? So your mineralization is largely concentrated to your saprolite and your saprock, which is what you'd expect. You can look at things like serum anomalies. Everyone in here will be familiar with the use of serum anomalies in reconstructing paleo environments and possibly even in rare earth deposits as well. Determining oxidation events and using those to inform our interpretation of regolith. As in a pristine profile going through a road cutting, you'd see a really nice change usually, and you'd have positive serum anomalies at the top of the weathering profile and negative at the bottom because you retain your serum at the top in minerals like serenite and hematite. The rest of your rare earths get transported down and they become relatively enriched relative to cerium at lower stratigraphic positions. Obviously, when you have a far older and a far more complex profile, it's not going to be quite that simple, but you can still sort of see that there are some patterns in cerium oxidation, that being positive or negative serum anomaly through the profile, which is kind of nice. The main benefit of the serum anomalies, though, is actually when you look at relative magnet rare earth element enrichment. So the magnet rare earth elements, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, they are where the bulk of the value is when you look at rare earth element deposits, because they are the elements that go into wind turbines, electric vehicles, everything that we need for a renewable energy future. So we want those relatively enriched in our deposit. Cerium is far less valuable. Lanthanum is far less valuable. So what serum anomalies do and what serum oxidation does is it actually, and this is sort of what we found at the deposit scale at Splinter Rock, it actually provides a built-in mechanism for neodymium enrichment, for praseodymium enrichment, for dysprosium enrichment, because you're removing your less economically valuable cerium from your cluster of rare earths that then travel down and deposit in other areas. And we see a really nice graph of that later. So by doing this method, you're basically taking two-dimensional data. So you can plot, for example, your rare earth grade against depth in the black plots in the top. And sure, you can see general trends, but it's hard to really determine how they relate to rock type where you should be exploring, what sort of rocks you're looking at when you're looking at these things. And it transforms that by performing these analyses into three-dimensional data where you actually have an understanding of what rocks you're looking at. And again, this is done very, very quickly. You're not having to analyze 3,000 dirt samples essentially, and 3,000 horrible fissile, really hard to log samples in order to get this information. You can do it through these analyses, and you can then start to actually build up and map out your deposit from a lithological perspective as well as from a geochemical perspective. And you can start to identify the features and the structures in it. The other thing it does is it confirms these features and these structures over the deposit scale. And again, I can't reiterate this enough. This is what is so important about these deposits, is that you get large volumes of material characterized. Again, if you were to take, and a lot of studies do this, they will take a pristine row cutting, which is fine because it's important to do these studies as well. But they'll take a really nice pristine weathering profile, pristine saprolite saprock, profile for a road cutting, and they'll analyze what the rare earths are doing. And typically what they'll see is you'll get gradual enrichment of rare earths towards the saprolite saprock boundary, because again, they're being mobilized down through the weathering profile by weathering fluids. And you'll get that enrichment at the saprolite saprock boundary, and then it will start to deplete again with further depth in the saprock. The same thing occurs with heavy rare earth element enrichment versus light rare earth element enrichment. Heavy is again being more valuable from an economic perspective. You'll get heavy rare earth element enrichment gradually increasing towards the boundary and then decreasing as you go into fresher and fresher rock. The question then is, how can we confirm this on the deposit scale that is necessary for an economic rare earth element deposit? This is one of the ways we can do that. We can characterize large volumes of material and look at the trends and confirm whether these trends correlate across entire deposits. In the case of splinter rock, it looks like that's true. So if you look at the total rare earth oxide, the top two graphs for center and for prop respectively, you get gradual rare earth element enrichment coming from the saprolite down towards that saprolite saprock interface. So where you have a general, again, we're talking over kilometers sometimes between samples, but you're getting a general idea of the trends. So that saprolite saprock interface is where you've got sort of samples of both. And then once you move past that interface, you start to deplete in your rare earths again, right? Because you're then going into the rare earth enrichment, or the base level of rare earth enrichment within the fresh granite, which is going to be less than in the weathered portion. So we can confirm that on the deposit scale, and we can also confirm using lambda values, which is basically lower lambda values means less steep chondrite normalized rare earth element plots. So more steep, you've got heavier light rare earth enrichment. Less steep, you've got heavy rare earth enrichment. So we want low values. We want less steep chondrite normalized plots to show that heavier earth enrichment. And that's sort of what we see, again, going from saprolite down towards the saprolite saprock boundary and then back into the saprock, or with depth in the saprock. You see these trends appearing at the deposit scale. And so this is a really, really valuable way of confirming those trends at the scale that is necessary for economic enrichment. Glossed over this really, really quickly before, but this is just these two plots sort of in the middle are just a really, really nice way of showing how strongly cerium anomalies relate to relative magnet rare earth element enrichment. So that percentage is not a percentage of whole rock. If we had 50% whole rock of magnet rare earths, I think everyone would be really, really, really happy. That is a relative enrichment relative to the other rare earths, right? Of those four elements. And you can see just how strongly cerium anomalies correlate with that relative magnet rare earth element enrichment. So that is to say that regolith-hosted rare earths deposits have a built-in mechanism of enriching these valuable rare earth elements. And so we need to be aware of that. And how do we adjust our exploration? How do we adjust our mining and our metallurgy to account for that? Speaking of metallurgy, we obviously do far fewer metallurgical tests typically than we do whole rock geochemistry tests, or at least in this case, this is what happened, because they tend to be more expensive and a bit more specialized in how you analyze for it. But we can apply then those rock types to the samples that we have for metallurgy. This is a bit more of a complicated graph because they didn't line up. Like the ones that were sent for metallurgy were like multiple 3 mil samples, excuse me, grouped together, and so it's harder to sort of get really clear trends. That was just the data that they had. But generally speaking, you can see this trend where at that saprolite-saprock boundary, that is sort of the optimal place for a number of things, for rare earth enrichment as a whole, for relative heavy rare earth enrichment, for recovery, and also for acid consumption. So when you leach the material with your acid, obviously you're going to lose your acid with reaction with the rock. That is a big cost for these deposits, is that acid consumption. So you want really low acid consumption so you can recycle it, reuse it, reduce costs. And so that is another consideration that a lot of the time we don't have. And for all of those things, that boundary seems to be sort of the optimal sweet point, basically. And you can only infer this on the larger scale by doing these sorts of analyses. If you then go and get new samples, instead of redoing the k-means clustering and redoing the PCA every single time you get new samples in, because you're always going to be expanding the exploration area, the number of samples you have, you can use the principal component analysis to actually define geochemical ratios that are representative of that analysis. So for instance, here, if we take this PCA analysis of center, I'm pretty sure this is the center one. It will say it somewhere. Yes, center there. If you take to within reason, there's sort of an art to selecting the right elements, but to within reason, if you take the extremes of PC1, so in this case, antimony and yttrium along that line there, and of PC2, you can generally replicate the PCA results in a normal ratio plot rather than having to redo this analysis every single time. So now when you have a new sample, you can plot cesium, thorium, antimony, yttrium on that sample and see whereabouts it plots here. And it starts to help you infer what sample you're looking at. Are you looking at transported sediments? Are you looking at granitic saprock, saprolite, whatever it may be? And that can be done in multiple levels of complexity. These are some other plots for some multi-element ratios, which I won't bore you with in this moment. If you're interested, please talk to me or any of the other authors. Or there's a link to the paper in the slides as well. But that is to say, you can use these analyses to actually define new ratios so that when you get new samples, you don't have to redo everything. You can just plot those ratios and very informed decisions straight away on what rock you're looking at. So that pretty much covers everything. I will stop talking now, and if there are any questions, yeah, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Tobias. That was amazing. There's a lot to take in on that last slide.
Yes, I apologize. That is
No, that's great.
yeah, there's a lot there.
I have to admit, I did have a glance at your paper, but it's a much easier introduction to listen to the talk today. So I'll have to go back to the paper now. It's good. Thank you. Hop off.
No worries.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, if it's possible to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Hi, Toby. Yeah, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation, and it's good to see you talking on top of the paper that I read like some time ago. I had just a question regarding the PCA process. So I assume that you did some log transform ratios to that you apply to the PCA. So you grouped all the rare earths as a TREO as one variable, if I get it right. And you also included some element ratios. So I'm not sure, can we use element ratios on top of proper element concentrations and put all together into a log transformation to apply a PCA? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I will bring up, I've closed the thing, but I'll bring that up again just so I can go through it. Because this was one of the questions, and it's a very valid question. So for those who aren't as familiar, a lot of the time when you do these sorts of analyses, you need to avoid including elements that are very highly co-correlated. because this can heavily bias the analyses essentially. So let me just scoot back through this. Oh, this is so slow. I do apologize. Because it is a very good point, and it is one that when I first did it, I didn't pick up on, and then I had to redo the whole PCA again, which was a bit of a pain. So I learned that lesson the hard way. Which is probably the best one. I guess we'll go with, I think this next one's the largest. Yeah, okay, we'll go with this one. So yeah, you can see that there are, we use total rare earth oxide, and then there are also some other element ratios in there. So we have, in terms of rare earth elements at least, so we have this box here is actually this box down here just blown up to basically show what these are, because labeling them in this space is not very easy. So the general way I like to think of it is, will the occurrence of one thing, is it likely to, or is there a way in which you can infer that another thing will also occur based on that one? So for instance, I can infer that if in a rock I have particularly high cesium or cerium, I'm also likely to have particularly high lanthanum, because the rare earths do similar things. They all sort of work together, right? So when I look at this, I can go, okay, well, I have high total rare earth oxide. Is that going to affect my europium anomaly? Well, no, there's no distinct correlation between total rare earth oxide and europium anomaly. Like the europium anomaly can be one thing as a value, and it can be high or it can be low total rare earth oxide. Is it going to affect my yttrium-holmium ratio? Well, probably not, because the yttrium-holmium ratio is a product of geochemical processes that are distinct from rare earth element enrichment processes. So the values of these elements and the values of these ratios are separate. They're not there. There's no obvious connection between the two. You can have either high or you can have low, or high or low rare earth element enrichment. So yeah, it's a very, very valid point, and it is one that I was called out on and I had to fix. It fixed it a little, like it made some changes, not a huge amount, not as many as I was expecting, but it did make some changes. But yes, you're right that in terms of the processing of the data, I've given a PCA talk before where I went into that, and everyone just shuts down a lot. So I decided for this one, for those who are interested, they can read the paper. But yes, it went through multiple stages of data scrubbing and data prep before the analysis.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And I believe the absence of silica is also could be also
Yeah,
like
they actually didn't analyze for silica. We didn't have silica in the whole rock data.
yeah,
I
it's a quite
called
common issue.
OD6 about that. I was like, why is there no silica? And they were like, oh, it's just the method we chose. I was like, cool. At that point, there's not much I can do. Yeah.
Yeah, ICP-MS. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
No worries.
Great question. Thanks, Yoram. Do you have any other questions? I've got one for you, Toby. With the plots of the section, I really loved how you use is it grayscale for the showing the concentration, ppms. I just thought that was really good. Is that because you just had already used the colors for the clusters, or is it because it actually works really well? I actually really like that. I like that a bit more than looking at like reds for high, or purple. That's actually quite a good way. And I guess for people, I was thinking for accessibility, it's actually probably an easier way for people to see it as well.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to comment
I'm
on
one of
it.
these people. I like working in tones just generally. To me, maybe it's like an aesthetic thing for me, but to me, tones just tend to be quite cleaner. It looks cleaner to me than even when I try to make like maps and stuff. Those sort of pastel tones and like they just appear more muted to me, and so they appear easier to look at. Unless you want something to really stand out, which is why I went for these clusters in the brighter colors and the colors. But in terms of something that is continuous, like rare earth grade, it makes sense to use a spectrum of the same color. So yeah, and yeah, it worked out quite nicely in this case. The discussion then is how many groups do you group a grade into, which is quartiles seem to make most sense to me, which is why there are 4 of them. But yeah, yeah, personal preference. And again, in terms
No.
of accessibility, that's one concern that I did have with the paper in general, in terms of, maybe red-green colorblind. There's greens and there's reds in these plots. Generally, those ones don't actually overlap in most of the plots. There's not a huge amount of
Yes.
overlap in those colors.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that it's not too much of an issue for people with color blindness. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, it's good. I think it's always interesting, you get used to seeing things a certain way. So I would love to see more ASX releases and other things using the tones for grade. I think that's a really great way of just presenting it. It says it differently. So that's one. Thank you. Just that was a general comment. Do we have any other questions? Oh, that's good. I think I really appreciate how the clustering's actually really picked out those different, I guess the pseudo, well, they are where we know the sort of units within the regolith profile, which is really great. So did you do much work to constrain that further as part of this project, or to understand sort of how that's, sorry?
Yeah, so it was, like I said, it was a project that I started off with the geochemistry. I knew I had to do some sort of validation. I didn't know how that was going to work. But then the guys at CSR are working on the same deposit, and they were like, we're working on sort of detailed mineralogy and detailed landscape evolution. We have these logs. That paper is, I believe, still in review at the moment. And so I basically just said, oh, would you mind if I used a couple of these to just define these clusters that we have? It seems like a really sensible way of doing it. So that's sort of how that came about. And for me, when you see something that is, even over 2 drill cores as well, that appears to match up in the way that these ones do, it just, like I said, it's that vote of confidence that, okay, these are showing things that are actually real and that make sense. Which again, you'd expect, right? So any sort of geochemical variance, you'd expect there to be differences between saprolite and overlying transported estuarine sediments, right? So you expect there to be some degree of geochemical variation. It's just how strongly that comes through sometimes, and whether the method, you've applied the method in a way that can actually extract that information in a way that it works. And in this case, it worked quite nicely. So that was a big benefit, I think.
Yeah,
So yeah,
maybe a very quick comment. Sorry.
No,
yeah, because if we are happy to use like sub-element ratios within the data dimension reduction, could be either through PCA or even through UMAP. We could apply some k-means clustering on the results of a UMAP if we wanted to. The titanium to zirconium ratios would be a very good indicator for transported versus residual. So that could be maybe instead of having titanium and zirconium as two input variables, maybe their ratio could be tested as one of the input variables to further decipher the transported versus residual. Just would be interesting to see the results of something using the titanium zirconium ratio for classification.
And yeah, there'll be ratios that exist throughout the literature, right, for different deposits and different examples. I suppose the benefit of doing this sort of analysis on a particular deposit you have is that it will be unique to that deposit. So
yes.
I had one of the questions in review was like, okay, well, I showed some ratios at the end. They were like, what's the applicability of these ratios to like a deposit in like South America, for example? And the answer is like, well, there's gonna be some fundamental processes where transported sediments will have a different chemistry to granitic sediments or saprolite. So they may be applicable in certain instances based on if there are similar processes happening. In other instances, they may not. But the sort of benefit of, like I said, tailoring your analysis to a specific deposit is that it's tailored to your deposit. And so any information you get, is going to work where you're at. In terms of zirconium, titanium, when you look at the PCA, they're a really interesting ones. They sit between this sort of granitic saprolite and the overlying regolith formation, and they sort of sit slap bang in the middle. So there may be some variation. I haven't looked, but in terms of like looking at me like, well, how can I separate these to the greatest degree that I can separate them? That's where the beauty of the PCA comes in, is that you can look at that and you can go, yeah, okay, arsenic is just so massively enriched in the transported sediments relative to the in situ saprock and saprolite. And actually, in one of the other ones, we use arsenic as a tool to help separate them. Positive serum anomalies, again, quite positive over here in the transported sediments relative to the saprolite. And actually, in terms of zirconium and titanium in particular, they're really, really good when you compare to, because they're obviously very, very immobile elements. When you start to compare them then to your mobile elements, your cesium, your calcium, your magnesium, they give a very, very good degree of the extent of weathering as well. So that's what you're sort of looking at on the y-axis here, is your extent of weathering, whereby your granitic saprock is not as weathered as your saprolite, and your youngest sediments on the top are probably not as weathered as the sediments beneath them, because they haven't had the time to be weathered, they haven't had the time to be eroded. And so yeah, you can do deep dives into, okay, well, once you have all the chemistry, and this, one of the other questions I had in review was like, oh, well, you can do this with like 10 elements rather than 35. And it's like, we probably can, but the extra information you get from using more elements, if you're willing to go into that interpretation and really defining things to the degree to which you can when you have rock geochemistry, to me is really, really valuable, right? And so would I have been able to define these trends had I only used 10 elements? Maybe, maybe not.
No, totally agree. Cool. Yeah.
So yeah, it's for sure, and yeah, there are ways to look at ratios and be like, yeah, that could work, we can do that. That's for people. I'm done with this project now for the moment, so that's for people to carry on if they want to carry on.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tobias. It's like a real great snapshot of just, the process of actually getting this paper out as well, and the iterations. I know with something like this where it's quite data heavy, then I can understand it's such a process to ensure you've got that data right before it gets published. So what a big effort from you all.
Yeah, people have preferences. People who work with data have preferences. It should have been analyzed like this. It should have been done this, and
yeah,
a lot of them are legitimate. Some of them are just preferences. We had one person who was saying, why did you use k-means because of X, Y, and Z? I was like, because it's quick and anyone can do it. It's probably one of the simplest ways of doing things. So yeah, data. I learned a lot about publishing data-heavy papers from this one for sure.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've grilled you enough for Wednesday lunchtime. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been great. We've really appreciated hearing about the work, and it's good to get this sort of snapshot. I mean, obviously some of your co-authors are here on the chat today, but just to be able to understand the work and I mean, I've been learning a lot recently about sort of regolith-hosted rare earths and granites, and thinking about it here in South Australia. So it's quite topical actually. So thank you so much for presenting today. All right, so yeah, everyone's giving you big thanks in the chat. I reckon that's it. We started our AGM very late, and thank you for everyone who came back and joined the Zoom call to make the AGM, and for everyone else, your patience and waiting to get Tobias on the line too. So it's been great. We've really enjoyed today's webinar and AGM, and just thanks for everyone here at ARGA Specialist Group. We haven't got a webinar slotted in for another month. So if you are interested in presenting, could be anything, case study, your honours project from 10 years ago, we don't really mind. We'd love to hear from you. So do get in touch. We've got lots of spaces available. We're hoping that we will have some joint meetings in the future. There are still community positions available if people would like to join. If not, I'll say goodbye and catch you all soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye. Thanks, guys. Easy.